Today, supporters of Russia's opposition marched in cities across the country to call for a boycott of the upcoming March 18th presidential elections. According to Russia's Interior Ministry, more than 4,500 people demonstrated over 46 of the country's regions. And according to the OVD-Info, non-governmental organization, around 250 people have been detained by law enforcement. One of those people was opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was tackled by police in Moscow and forced into a police bus. The anti-corruption activist had been banned from running for president elections after being found guilty of embezzlement in a criminal case widely believed to be politically motivated. But he has still spent the last year traveling across the country and campaigning. We have Andrew Roth, Moscow-based Washington correspondent, live from Moscow, talking to us. Andrew, so how big were the protests? We are really, thanks for joining us, first of all, but really, how significant is that event? Because I think everybody looking forward for the elections and looking for some kind of protest to take place.
Hi, Natalia. Thanks for having me. You know, the protests, I would say today weren't as large as protests that we've seen in the past, definitely in comparison to what we saw in June, where there were a lot more people out and there were a lot more people who were arrested. You know, it's surprising because the elections are so soon, they're happening in a month, but I think that it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin is going to have a strong victory in the elections. The question right now is all about turnout. You know, the Kremlin really wanted to see the strategy of 70-70, that's 70% turnout, 70% of people voting for Putin. Navalny's trying to spoil that by bringing people out onto the streets and organizing a boycott of the vote. We saw a lot of breadth today, so a lot of cities that took part, but compared to past elections, the numbers weren't as, compared to past protests, the numbers really weren't as high.
Are that really just the Navalny supporters this time? Because the last year protests, they were more about, they were not so much about Navalny himself, but more about anti-Putin or anti-Medvedev protests, anti-government protests. So were this really political? And if his political force, Navalny political force, is arguing for boycotting, how it's seen by, for instance, those opposition candidates like Ksenia Sobchak who are taking part in the elections?
Yeah, it's a really divisive issue at the moment. I think that, I mean, even within those people who really support Navalny or really support a kind of a strong turn away from Putin, there is still this sort of like existential question, I would say, to a certain degree. If you disagree with Putin, do you sort of vote against him like we had in the 2012 elections? Or do you just completely decide not to vote at all, what used to be called против всех in Russia, the kind of against all option that at this point is just represented by people who don't support him. So Navalny's broken with a lot of the other people who are opposition candidates. You know that there's an opinion among a lot of people that Sobchak, for instance, who is an opposition candidate, is actually a spoiler and is designed to get people excited about these elections. That could be a reason why we didn't see as many people out on the streets today. To be honest, I think it's more about weather conditions. It's cold out. I think that when people want to go out in the summer, because there is a very sort of social component to protesting, that right now those sort of winter protests, just the amount of energy that's going on, a lot of the other things that are happening in the moment in politics in Russia, I think that that's more the reason that we should look for why there might not have been as many people out on the streets today. It doesn't always mean that the number of people who come out are specifically the number of people who support or kind of agree with Navalny's approach to elections. That, you know, there should be a boycott.
It will be cold till the mid of March in Russia. That's what we for sure can say. It won't be much warmer. But really about those arrests, I know it's sometimes, people are getting used that the people are arrested. So, and it happens that later they are freed, those who had been arrested. Is it more or less the same thing this time?
You know, I've been here for a long time, so I've kind of seen people being arrested for a long period. I haven't been down to the courts yet tonight, so I'm not sure about the situation. From what I've heard, a lot of the people have been released. It's not like in June where there was a really high level of confusion about how many people were arrested, how many people were going to be held for a long period of time. When there are smaller crowds, Moscow police are better, Russian police are better at processing them. To be honest, the biggest kind of reason that you'll see people be imprisoned for a long period of time is because police stations don't know how to deal with protesters. So when you start involving these kind of like regional sticks kind of police officers who aren't used to dealing with protesters, that's when you have kind of people being in jail for 15 days or longer. I haven't seen the latest data, so I'm not sure if Navalny's out at the moment. But I would assume that most of the protesters who were picked up are going to be out tonight. It's not going to be the kind of long-term holding that we would see earlier this year or even back in 2012 or 2013.
Andrew, thanks a lot for explaining it all to our audience. That was Andrew Roth, currently the Washington Post correspondent based in Moscow. And we'll be back in a second.